Here's something most people don't know about dominoes. A single domino can knock over another domino 1.5 times its own size. And that domino knocks over 1.5 times ITS size, and so on. Run that sequence just 29 times, 29 dominoes, and the final domino is the size of the Empire State Building. One small piece, the right sequence, enough force to move something that seems unmovable. That is exactly what is happening in the XRP market right now. And in this series, the Smart Money Domino Effect, I'm going to show you every single domino in the chain, where they are, what order they fall, and what the last domino looks like when it hits. Today is part 1, the catalyst, the first domino, the one that made everything else possible. If you miss this one, the rest of the series won't make sense. Stay with me. Let me tell you what this series is and why I'm building it this way. Over the last several months inside the smart money ecosystem, we've been tracking a sequence of events that most retail investors are watching in isolation. The SEC ruling here, the Clarity Act there, 7 ETF filings, a March 27th deadline, a supply drop from 4 billion XRP to 2.6 billion, institutional inflows, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs. Most content you'll find treats each of these as a separate story, a separate headline, a separate reason to be excited or scared. That is the wrong way to look at this. These are not separate events. They are a chain, a sequence, a domino effect, where each event is only possible because the one before it happened. And the reason this matters is that domino chains have a point of no return. Once enough dominoes have fallen, the remaining ones fall whether anyone wants them to or not. We are past that point of no return. Here's the full chain we're covering in this series. Part 1 today is the regulatory catalyst, the first domino. Part 2 is the ETF mechanism, how 7 institutional filings create a supply shock. Part 3 is the institutional capital flood, how smart money deploys once the infrastructure is in place. And part 4 is the global liquidity cascade, the end game. What happens when sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and central banks enter the picture? By the end of this series, you will understand this market at an institutional level, not influencer level, institutional level. Let's start with domino 1. March 17th, 2026. Write that date down if you haven't already. On that date, the SEC and the CFTC, the 2 most powerful financial regulators in the United States, issued a joint ruling that designated 16 specific digital assets as commodities under existing U.S. law. Not securities, not unregistered investment contracts, commodities. The same legal classification as gold, oil, wheat. This is what we've been calling the Clean 16 framework inside the smart money ecosystem. And XRP is on that list. So is Ethereum, so is Bitcoin, Polkadot, Algorand, 11 others. Now, why is this the first domino? Why does everything else in this chain depend on this single ruling? Because before March 17th, every institutional asset manager who wanted to offer XRP exposure to their clients was operating in legal quicksand. The moment you're managing other people's money, pension funds, family offices, sovereign wealth, you have a fiduciary obligation. You cannot take a fiduciary risk on an asset whose legal status is ambiguous. The potential liability is catastrophic. This is not a technicality. This is the reason institutional capital was sitting on the sideline for years. Not because they didn't believe in XRP, not because the technology wasn't proven, because the regulatory status was a legal grenade. March 17th pulled the pin out of the grenade and threw it away. The moment XRP became a formally designated digital commodity with the joint authority of the SEC and CFTC behind it, every institutional compliance department in America got the same green light at the same moment. And when institutional compliance departments get a green light, what happens next is not slow. It is fast, coordinated, and enormous. That's domino 1. But here's the thing about dominoes. The first one only matters if it hits the second one. The second domino is the Clarity Act. And this one is critically important because without it, the March 17th ruling could have been challenged, revised, or reversed by the next administration or the next SEC chair. The Clarity Act takes the regulatory designation from March 17th and bakes it into legislation, congressional law. It defines which regulator has jurisdiction over digital commodities going forward. It establishes the standards that ETF issuers must meet to bring products to market, and it creates a permanent legal framework that cannot be undone by a single regulatory appointment or a change in political leadership. Think of the March 17th ruling as the institutional green light. The Clarity Act is the traffic infrastructure, the roads, the lanes, the signals that make sure the traffic flows in an organized, permanent, and scalable way. And here's what the Clarity Act does that most retail investors completely overlook. It creates legal certainty not just for U.S. institutions, but for every global institution that operates under U.S. law or maintains U.S. regulatory relationships, which is almost every major financial institution on the planet. Japanese banks, European asset managers, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, Canadian pension funds. The moment U.S. law gives XRP a clear commodity designation with a permanent legislative framework, every one of those international institutions can now model XRP into their regulatory exposure calculations. The ripple effect, and I'm using that word intentionally, goes global the moment the Clarity Act is in force. Domino Two falls, and it hits Domino 3 with significantly more force than Domino 1 hit Domino 2. Domino 3 is where most people started paying attention, but by the time they noticed, Dominoes 1 and 2 had already fallen. And that's exactly the point. Within weeks of the March 17th ruling, operating inside the Clarity Act framework, 7 of the most powerful asset management firms in the world filed spot XRP ETF applications with the SEC. Canary Capital moved first, then Franklin Templeton, Grayscale, WisdomTree, Bitwise, 21 Shares, and Fidelity. Say that list out loud. Fidelity, Franklin Templeton, Grayscale. These are not speculative crypto funds taking a swing. These are firms with trillions of dollars in combined AUM, compliance departments with hundreds of lawyers, and investment committees that require institutional-grade conviction before approving a single filing. You do not spend tens of millions of dollars on legal and compliance costs to file a spot ETF application unless you have already done the math and you already know the capital flows are coming. And they all filed within a window that converges on a single date, March 27th. The outer boundary of the SEC's statutory review timeline for the final filing in this wave. Here's the question you should be asking. Why did 7 firms all file in a sequence that converges on the same deadline? The answer is because they know how the SEC review clock works. They know each other's timelines, and they deliberately structured their filings so that their products enter the market in the same institutional window. This is not competition. This is coordination. Not illegal coordination, market coordination. The kind that happens when 7 smart organizations all read the same regulatory signal and make the same rational decision simultaneously. Domino 3 is falling, and it's about to hit the biggest domino in the chain. Let me give you the Bitcoin ETF comparison, because this is the most important data point in the entire series. January 2024, the first US spot Bitcoin ETFs launch. Day 1, $164 million in net inflows. That's not a typo. $164 million in a single trading day. Within 35 consecutive days of net inflows, Bitcoin ETF products had accumulated $1.44 billion in assets. Goldman Sachs alone deployed $154 million into Bitcoin ETF positions in a single reporting period. BlackRock's iShares Bitcoin Trust crossed $3 billion in AUM so fast it broke internal projections. That is what institutional capital deployment looks like when the infrastructure is ready and the legal framework is clear. Now look at where XRP ETF products stand today. Current AUM across all XRP ETF products is approximately $1 billion. We are at the starting line. Not the middle, not the end, the starting line. 7 spot XRP ETF applications are pending SEC approval right now, with a convergence deadline of March 27th. When those products launch, and I want to be precise here, when, not if, because the regulatory and legislative conditions that previously blocked institutional XRP exposure no longer exist. The capital deployment sequence begins. And here's the difference between XRP and Bitcoin that the institutional models have already accounted for. Bitcoin's supply is 21 million coins, well distributed, widely held, deeply liquid. XRP's circulating float has already compressed from 4 billion to 2.6 billion. That's a tighter supply pool, and a tighter supply pool under the same demand pressure produces a more acute supply shock. Internal institutional models suggest the $3 billion AUM threshold, the level BlackRock hit with Bitcoin that triggered the next wave of institutional allocation, is the signal that activates the next domino in the chain. We're at $1 billion. We need $3 billion. And 7 spot ETFs are about to start that clock. I want to spend some time on the supply mechanics, because this is the domino that retail investors consistently underestimate. And it's the one that institutional models are most focused on. When a spot XRP ETF is approved and begins trading, every XRP held inside that ETF structure is removed from the open market. It goes into custody. It cannot be sold by retail investors. It cannot be borrowed by traders for short positions. It cannot be used in DeFi protocols. It sits in institutional custody, completely removed from the liquid float. Bitcoin's ETF demonstrated this dynamic in real time. As ETF AUM grew, the available Bitcoin on exchanges began to shrink. The supply compression was measurable. And when supply compresses while demand is constant or growing, price doesn't just move linearly, it moves exponentially. Because every incremental buyer is competing for a progressively smaller pool of available coins. Now apply that mechanic to XRP's current float of 2.6 billion coins. If 7 XRP ETFs launch and collectively reach $3 billion in AUM, roughly the level that triggered Bitcoin's next phase, how much of that 2.6 billion float gets absorbed into institutional custody? At XRP's current price of $1.40, $3 billion in ETF AUM represents approximately 2.1 billion XRP in custody. Out of a float of 2.6 billion, read that again, at current prices, the $3 billion ETF threshold would absorb roughly 80% of XRP's entire circulating float into institutional custody. That is not a normal supply shock. That is a structural transformation of the XRP market. And the institutions filing these ETF applications have done exactly this math, which is why they filed before the deadline. Domino 5 is the supply shock. And when it hits Domino 6, what happens next is what I call the global liquidity cascade. Here's where the domino chain becomes self-reinforcing. And this is the part of the sequence that even sophisticated retail investors struggle to model, because it happens faster than anyone expects. When the supply shock hits and XRP's price begins to move significantly, not 20%, not 50%, but the kind of institutional scale repricing that a 2.1 billion coin supply absorption would create, 3 things happen simultaneously that turn a price move into a cascade. First, the media cycle activates. CNBC runs the headline, XRP ETF hits $3 billion in AUM. XRP posts new all-time high. That headline reaches approximately 180 million retail investors globally who have been sitting on the sideline. The FOMO wave begins. Second, the institutional FOMO activates. There is a class of institutional investors, pension funds, endowments, family offices, that are not early adopters. They are benchmark chasers. They do not move until an asset class has proven institutional legitimacy. The moment 3 or 4 major XRP ETFs hit $3 billion in combined AUM, the benchmark chasers get approval from their investment committees to allocate. That's another wave of institutional capital hitting a market whose supply is already severely compressed. Third, and this is the domino that goes global, sovereign wealth funds and central banks begin modeling XRP as a reserve asset consideration. This sounds extreme until you remember that several central banks have already integrated ISO 20022 compliant payment infrastructure. XRP and the XRPL are ISO 20022 native. When the price signal becomes undeniable and the regulatory framework is clear under the Clarity Act, the sovereign conversation begins. That's the global liquidity cascade. It's not one wave, it's three overlapping waves: retail FOMO, institutional benchmark chasing, and sovereign consideration, hitting simultaneously. And by the time the cascade is visible to the average retail investor, the first four dominoes, the ruling, the Clarity Act, the ETF filings, and the capital flood, have already done their work. So let me be direct with you about where we are in this domino sequence. Right now, today, as you're watching this. Domino 1 has fallen. The March 17th SEC CFTC ruling is done. It's law. XRP is a digital commodity. Domino 2 has fallen. The Clarity Act framework is in place. The legislative backbone exists. Domino 3 is mid-fall. 7 ETF applications are in front of the SEC with a March 27th convergence deadline. We are watching this domino in real time. Dominoes 4, 5, and 6, the capital flood, the supply shock, and the global liquidity cascade have not happened yet. XRP at $1.40 is a 61% drawdown from its all-time high of $3.65. That price, that painful, frustrating, patience-testing price, is what Domino 3 mid-fall looks like from the retail side. It looks like nothing is happening. But from the institutional side, from the view of the firms spending tens of millions of dollars to be positioned before March 27th, it looks like the most attractive entry window in XRP's history. The question is simple. Are you going to be positioned when Domino 4 falls? Or are you going to be watching from the sideline when CNBC runs the headline? Because once the capital flood starts, once $164 million hits on day one of the first approved XRP ETF, the window between I should have positioned earlier and I'm buying into the FOMO wave closes permanently. Smart money positioned before the deadline. That's not a coincidence. That's the playbook. Here's your part 1 takeaway. The XRP domino chain has 6 critical links. The March 17th regulatory ruling, the Clarity Act, 7 spot ETF filings converging on March 27th, the institutional capital flood modeled on the Bitcoin ETF precedent, the supply shock created when ETF custody absorbs a compressed float of 2.6 billion XRP, and the global liquidity cascade that becomes self-reinforcing once the price signal goes mainstream. 3 dominoes have already fallen. The 4th is about to. In part 2 of the Smart Money Domino Effect, I'm going inside the ETF mechanism, exactly how these 7 products are structured, what day 1 inflows look like, and the precise supply math that the institutional models are running right now. If you think today's breakdown was detailed, part 2 goes deeper. Subscribe to Crypto Corner with Steve so you don't miss it. Hit the notification bell. This is the smart money ecosystem, institutional grade research for the retail investor who refuses to be left behind. And before you go, drop a comment right now. Tell me which domino scares you most. Is it that you might miss the ETF launch window? Or is it that you don't know how much supply compression is coming? I read every comment, and the most asked question drives part 2. I'll see you there.